Hi, my name is Akemi Dawn Bowman, and I am the author of books that include Starfish, Summerbird Blue, and the most recent Harley in the Sky. And I'm here to talk about how to make readers feel emotion. So something that's always been very helpful to me is to try to write as honestly as I possibly can. And what I mean by that is to not necessarily write something that's an autobiography by any means, but when you're writing from your own lived experience or something that you've gone through, I think that it comes across in a very earnest and sincere way, and a very truthful way. It connects with people in a way that feels more raw and authentic. Something that I would suggest trying would be to maybe think of a memory or an experience that you've gone through that really had a big impact on you, and write about it, and write about it in a way that you're not holding back. Don't think about somebody else, standing over your shoulder reading your words, but just write it for you. And think not just how it made you feel, but how it changed you as a person, and how the person that you were maybe shaped the way that you responded, and really dig into that, because I think sometimes kind of getting to know your characters more, or these emotions more, is what helps you really excel at building characters in your stories. I think part of building a really good character is really knowing what makes them tick and what makes them react. And everybody responds differently to different situations. Nobody's exactly the same. And sometimes we react based on what we've gone through in life. And that changes from person to person. So I find that very interesting. I find that very fascinating. And I think that that's a great way to kind of get characters to express themselves and to make them different from one another. You're the expert on your own life, and so you know better than anyone what it felt like to be in a certain situation and how you reacted. And I think that that can really help to kind of get to know a character, because you're sort of digging through I guess your own memories and your own experiences of what emotion felt like. So whether it was anger or sadness or loss or love or whatever the case may be, you're tapping into something that's familiar. And I think if it's familiar to you, it will be familiar to somebody else and to a reader. And I think that's how you can kind of build a bridge and offer a mirror and a glimpse into somebody else's life. And I think all these things are ways that readers connect with your characters and feel bonded to them. If you sit down and sort of treat it as a diary entry where you're not really holding back and you're not worried about what someone will think, and you just write how it felt to be in that situation and how it felt to get out of that situation, and just don't hold back, just write very, very truthfully. I think in a lot of ways, writing that way can feel cathartic, but you can also learn a lot about yourself and a lot about your writing, and in turn, you'd be able to learn a lot about your characters. Because I think as you dig into emotion and you dig into why you react the way that you do, or why a character would react the way that they would react, you get to a place of really figuring out what makes their brain tick and what makes their heart, change and shift. And I think that these are all really important things, because as a reader, you want to bond with a main character. You want to get to know their journey and who they are. And I think part of really getting that across is making them feel real. Another thing that is really important for me to get across emotion is the sensory elements that are involved. When we have memories, it's not just a thought. It's often the feelings that come with it, and a lot of that comes with the environment around us, and what something smelled like or tasted like, or how the weather was. And I think that that really has an impact on the way that we perceive a situation sometimes. Whether it can spark anger or resentment, whatever the case may be. I think that the scenery involved and the sensory elements really, really shift the way it kind of sets the stage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think that that really helps for a reader to kind of feel like they're there and to feel like they're in the emotion as much as the character is. So something that I would suggest trying would be to kind of imagine yourself in a situation, or a character's in a situation, that is sort of a conflict of what they're feeling versus where they are. So if they're, very, sad and upset, for example, maybe they could be in some place, bright and colorful. Or if they're, very angry, maybe they're in, some place that should be their, favorite place in the world, and kind of show how the environment impacts emotion. I remember standing in line at Disneyland once and just getting like really bad news on the phone and being, a bit upset. And I remember thinking how surreal and strange it felt to be in a place that was supposed to be so happy and joyous, and to be feeling so down on the inside. And I'll never forget that moment, because it's something that had a big impact on me. It lasted because sort of the sensory elements didn't match up to what I was feeling. And I think sometimes working through that and explaining that can kind of like bring a lot of very creative elements of describing emotion. And so, yeah, I would suggest trying that. And I think one of the really important things too when you're kind of creating a character is to know not just where they are and where they're headed, but also where they've been. And I think there's a balance there of these three things that sort of really help you flesh out a character and make them feel real. I think as a reader, the more emotionally invested you get in a character usually has a lot to do with their backstory, just as much as the adventure that they're on. And we also care a lot about, what they want and what their goals are. Everybody kind of reacts to the world a little bit differently, and I think that has so much to do with where they've come from and their own experiences in life. And so I think it makes it very interesting to sort of create a character and really flesh out their backstory. And something that you could try doing would be to think of maybe a side character that you loved in a book, one of your favorites, and think of somebody who maybe didn't have a lot of, page time, or who didn't really have the chance to get that part of their story kind of fleshed out, and make it up and see if you can come up with like things that sort of make them feel more fully formed and fully developed. And there's a lot of fan fiction out there that does that wonderfully, and I think that it could be a really good kind of a way to practice what it's like to make a character feel richer. You can, of course, make up your own character as well, but sometimes it's just fun to jump into a world that's at least already familiar, because world building is such a big part of a book, obviously, and it's so important and it's so much fun, but the character building is sort of a separate thing in itself, and yes, they do have to get woven together, but when you're creating a character, you can create a character in an already fully formed world, and still create an interesting story and an interesting arc. And I think there's something very valuable about knowing that, because it sort of allows you to put more importance on the way that the character is feeling and stuff. You sort of treat it as, just as important as having, a solid plot with, twists and turns and whatnot. So just remember, too, that there isn't a right or a wrong way to write. There's only the right way for you. And that's something that I have to remind myself a lot, that it's not, about the way that somebody else may create something is completely different to the way that I create something, and that's okay. I think we all go at our own pace, and we're all on our own journeys, so to speak, even when it comes to writing. And it's okay to have fun with it. It's okay that, not everything that you write has to be, the perfect thing that you've ever written. And every little bit is practice, and even an unfinished manuscript and an unfleshed out character, that's still practice towards the next one that is going to be a little bit stronger and a little bit better and a little bit more where you want to be in your writing. And, emotions are messy, and they make people messy, and I think that's okay, and don't be afraid to explore that when you're making your characters. Everybody works through things differently, and I think sometimes that's what makes people want to learn about them or want to follow their journey. And if you want readers to care about your characters, then you have to give them a reason to want to care. And sometimes that is just watching them make mistakes and watching them work through things and handle situations that make them feel human. So yeah, I hope you will give the writing prompts a try, and thank you so much for listening.